I'm already on. And it's not even time yet. It's close. I don't know where the amen section is. Oh, okay. So Keith's with Alan. Yeah. I don't know where Billy is, but I guess Memorial Day weekend, maybe he's camping out somewhere. Maybe.
You never know. Well, he usually rides with Dawn.
This one?
He rides with Dawn.
Oh,
But
and
I haven't
Don's
seen
not.
Dawn either, so
Yeah, maybe they're.
I don't know. Wherever they are, we wish them well.
We do. Well, the big hand is pretty much straight down, so I guess that means it's time to start. Thank you, Bill. 2 weeks in a row he came in and fought the good fight, so I appreciate it. Watched the videos and did a fine job. Got some good discussion going, so I appreciate that very much. Today I don't know if this is good or bad, but here is sort of the whole broad view of Matthew that we've been trying to cover this quarter. Bill covered the parables, which was sort of the punchline of the gospel last time. We're going to look a bit at chapters 14 through 17. We're not going to get to 17, but this is the last class of the quarter. So we'll have to give it a shot for the second half somewhere down the line. But I knew that was going to happen before we even started. I don't know that the last time I taught a class we actually got where we were supposed to, so.
Which book are you?
This is the book of Matthew.
Okay.
I guess I should have put a title on this one. I think it was my second slide of the first class, and so Matthew was on the first slide, and this was sort of a second slide, but I never fixed it. So, book of Matthew, and it's arranged. Scholars have put this together kind of in this chiastic pattern where we all come down, and the kingdom of heaven is front and center throughout this whole book, and the parables give kind of like the brushstroke showing us what the kingdom is like. And so you sort of think about those parables, and that gives you sort of the picture of the kingdom that Jesus is continually bringing up and focusing on. The other thing that's interesting to me, and I never really thought about this, sorry, until I looked at this, is the alternating pattern that's up there. Okay, and so you get this first little bit is narrative, and so narrative is stories, interactions, conversation, things that Jesus does. And then what you get next is a sermon. And then you go back and you get a little more story, conversation, interaction, and another sermon. And often these stories and conversations lead into the sermon. So you kind of get what's going on and then the theory behind it. A little bit of what's going on, the theory behind it. So we've kind of worked our way down. Kingdom of God is a big thing in this. And then we're going to see here today some things that Jesus does, but it's going to end up where we won't get to is sort of Peter's confession of who Jesus is. And so after all this time, the light bulb goes off. Okay. And there's lots of things to say about that, which some other quarter down the line will do that. So we're here in a narrative section, and so we'll cover a few of those things today. Last Sunday, Bill covered parables, so pictures of the brushstrokes of what is the kingdom of heaven like, forming a picture. We're going to start today with when Jesus had finished these parables, he moved on. Okay, and so the narrative section comes up, he moves on, and we're going to see some things that he does. Okay. Pictures, he's going to feed 5,000, he's going to walk on water, he's going to heal, he's going to do things that Jesus has been doing. And this is just building up more and more towards what the kingdom is about. And the disciples, when the light bulb goes off, well, this is what the kingdom is about. Okay, and to us, honestly, that's our task as well. Some of these things we see Jesus doing, healing, providing, feeding, that's what we do. Okay, the kingdom continues. But here's sort of the little section that leads into a couple of big stories that we'll cover today. And this is one that raises up the idea of a prophet. I don't know whether to do this or not, if it's worth it. Let me just say a little bit about it. Scholars, when they look at the Gospels, they do what they call Christology. Okay? Christology is we're trying to pull together all of the strands and all of the models, if you will, of what Jesus is about. Because Jesus is way too big for our little brains to just comprehend. And so we get this description of him in so many different ways. One of them is a prophet. Okay, a prophet's not a big topic in the Gospel of Matthew, but it is important, and it's there several times, and I'll pull up a slide here. But Jesus, one of the aspects of his life and character and at the heart of what he does is the idea that he's a prophet, and people perceive him that way. And so prophet carries through these next few stories. And it's kind of the punchline in this little pericope, this little thing that's right here, this little section, where he interacts. And at the end of it, it is one of the places that identifies him as a prophet. But there's others. So when Jesus had finished these parables, he moved on from there, coming to his hometown. And we suppose that this is Nazareth, and not the one that he had adopted later on as his place, Capernaum, but back in Nazareth, which is, I mean, it's a struggle. It's uphill all the way, and a ways off, a few miles, but he went back to his hometown. Coming to his hometown, he began teaching the people in their synagogue, and they were amazed. Okay? And we got to think about that word amazed. What does that mean? Okay, a lot of things. We can be amazed at certain things, but what they said was not what they expected. Okay? There was sort of what the church answers were to everything back then, and that's kind of a metaphor, but they were surprised, and it struck them. Okay, so they were amazed. Where did this man get this wisdom and these miraculous powers, they asked? Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? Aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Aren't all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things? And then verse 57 is kind of an interesting thing. They were amazed, but it made them mad. Okay? And they took offense at him. The Greek word that we take as offense is the same word that we get the English word scandal from. So scandalizo is the word that's there. So that has implications of more just being personal anger, or we're just ticked off about something. This is, they're looking at him and they're thinking he did something wrong. Some religious misstep. Something's not quite right about this. And so scandals are sort of that thing. There's something under the surface here that's not right. And so they took offense at him. They were scandalized by what he did, which is interesting. Okay, this is his hometown people. What's up with that? They ought to be proud of the guy that's making all these waves, but no, not at all. And Jesus pulls this idea of prophet. Okay, one of the ways we look at Jesus as a prophet. The other one we see quite often as a prophet is who? Not Peter. Well, I don't know about Peter, but John the Baptist. Okay, John the Baptist is front and center, identified with Elijah. And I'll even pull up a slide here in a minute. So Jesus also wears the garment of prophet and refers to himself here as not honored, because when you know the person, who honors him as something higher. Okay, so but Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown, in his own town, in his own home. Okay, so they're in Nazareth. They're scandalized rather than in a sort of positive sense, amazed. And he did not do many miracles there because of their lack of faith. Okay, it's interesting. Faith carries through a lot of these stories. And so it's worth thinking about. Okay, faith, we think about, well, we believe in Jesus and this kind of thing. But in these stories, it's interesting when faith gets brought up and the qualifiers that are there. Here, there's lack of faith. And lack of faith, I think, ties into, there's the kingdom of heaven, and then there is the kingdom of Satan. And it's kind of a dualistic approach in this gospel. And so this lack of faith means that you have identified with this other one. Okay, you're over here and not over here. Just to say a word about that, faith is carried from story to story here. Here there's lack of faith. It's interesting in the next little bit, the disciples, who are Jesus' close friends and people following around, when Peter sinks into the water, what does Jesus say about him? Little faith. Okay, so we got lack of faith, we've got little faith, and then we have these unexpected people down the line. We probably won't get to it, but there's the Canaanite woman. She's from Syria, way up north, and Jesus has little use for her. We see he's pretty rude. I've come to the Israelites, not the people around. And yet, when he heals her, he says, great faith. And so we need to think about what faith is, and it's kind of your choice of kingdom of heaven versus Satan's kingdom in this book. Any thoughts before we move on to the next bit? Chad?
This story it's interesting that it's included kind of the way it is, because to me it kind of points out a universal truth. I mean, we all recognize that you're least appreciated where you're best known. And now it's almost a cliche to say, a prophet in his own town. I mean, it's kind of a thing that people say to, like, well, of course I'm, not appreciated. They know me too well.
They know your foibles, yeah.
Right. But to say even Jesus wasn't immune from that. That he was kind of taken for granted or kind of dismissed because they did know him. And
it wasn't like a metropolis. This was small town stuff. So
right.
They certainly did.
Which maybe was worse.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
Expect him to be like them, and if you're not like them, then you should be distrusted.
Well, I mean, he's always at odds with oh, go ahead, Chuck.
Well, they're saying he's a carpenter's son. I mean, back then he should have been a carpenter too, and just been okay with that. And his son would have been a carpenter, and he's messing up the whole order of things by doing this.
We don't like to be out of our comfort zone.
Right.
My wife tells me that often, and it's true. Anything else for you? Yeah, Dave?
You used the word pericope.
I did. That's the right word, isn't it, Jay? Pericope. Okay. I thought in the middle of it. That's been 40 years since I used that. So in the Old Testament, is especially when scholars look at a passage, it's often built of little segments. And so a pericope is sort of a introduction, conclusion, and all of the stuff that's in there. So we could break the Psalms up into pericopes, so little sections. And so this is kind of a section. We're going to go into another section. And so I don't know where that word came from out of my brain, but pericope. So.
Period. Okay.
Is that what you recall? I mean, it's been 50 years almost for me. So, okay.
Isn't that how the book of Mark is typically referred to as how it is written?
Written as little sections, little pericope. And Matthew is too, because we're going to see this goes, and then there is feeding the 5,000 is another pericope, a little section, and then as we go. Let me go ahead and point out, though, that this one introduces the next section because prophet is brought up. And remember, we talked about who's identified as a prophet. Well, Jesus is to some degree. John the Baptist is big time, okay? So the next section, naturally enough, is John the Baptist, okay? So a prophet is without honor. Well, let's talk about the prophet, okay? And these are just some scriptures, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but these are just passages out of the book of Matthew that talk about John the Baptist and his role as a prophet. And for example, in the first one, from the days of John the Baptist till now, the kingdom of heaven has been subjected to violence, and violent people have been raiding it. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John, and if you are willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. Whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. And so John the Baptist is Elijah. This is one of the strains of the prophets running through Matthew. Here's another one. But I tell you, this is in verse 12, Elijah has already come. Okay, so Elijah is John the Baptist. Here's a couple about Jesus. When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowds answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." So both of them are when you think about who is John the Baptist, who is Jesus, prophet is part of that picture you paint in your head. Okay, there was some of that. To us, in modern times, I think it means less. And perhaps to them who prophets were part of their history and part of their people and part of their culture, I think it meant more. But part of the picture that's there is a prophet. So let's see about the prophet. John the Baptist is beheaded. Okay, this is one of the odd stories in the gospel because it's not about Jesus. All of the other ones, all of the other pericopes, are about Jesus directly. This one is the odd one out. Okay, this one is about John the Baptist, but we've just said leading up to this that a prophet is without honor. Let's see a prophet without honor. And what I'm going to kind of indicate to you is that John the Baptist is introduced here, but Jesus as prophet shows up in the next few stories. Okay, so this is kind of a continuous string that goes through these. And I'll try and point that out a little more explicitly when I get there. So here is John the Baptist when he is beheaded. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the reports about Jesus, and he said to his attendants, "This is John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead." And so he's afraid of Jesus, okay, because he thinks John the Baptist is resurrected. Now, that's a little odd to me. So resurrection must have been a thing back then, not just amongst the church folks, but outside Herod, who certainly wasn't a church folk, thinking about resurrection and thinking about John the Baptist, who he'd killed. And Jesus has come back, and now here's this same prophet back again. And remember, prophets, one of the things they did is they were spokesmen, but they were always speaking truth to power. If you go back to the Old Testament, the prophet was always in the king's face about something. And so it was the conflict, the kingdom that was there. And here, John the Baptist, we're going to get a flashback to when he was beheaded. And what we're going to see is he was speaking truth to power. Okay, he was talking to the king about things he was doing. So Herod hears about Jesus. He thinks, "Oh man, John the Baptist has come back after I killed him." And then it goes back and tells the story of John the Baptist. Okay, so John the Baptist, he has risen from the dead. That's why miraculous powers are at work in him. Now, verse 3 is the flashback. Now Herod had arrested John and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of the people because they considered John a prophet. Okay, prophet shows up again. On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for the guests and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." The king was distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he ordered that her request be granted. And he had John beheaded in the prison. His head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, who carried it to her mother. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it, and then they went and told Jesus. Okay, so we see the prophet, how he's treated, the death of John the Baptist. Just wondered if that raised any thoughts in your head. It's an interesting story. Yes, sir. Right.
Won't respect the man's wife. You know, it's like, it's funny how you can pick and choose.
Oh, yeah.
You know, that just, it's amazing now.
Yeah.
The Pharisees, they were doing certain things, but they weren't doing other things. It's like, why are you doing one thing and not the other?
And not the other. Yeah, it's interesting.
Consistency.
And it's interesting how he is playing politics here, because he's worried about the people and what they're going to think, and not about killing this guy's okay. And this is, if you look carefully at it, the duality in this book, the kingdom of God versus the kingdom of Satan. It's interesting that he identifies Herod here as a king. Okay, he knows he's not. Okay, Herod is not a king. If you notice in the first line, Herod the Tetrarch. Okay, Herod is a tetrarch, which means he's a puppet ruler for the Romans. Okay, so Caesar appointed him to be essentially the guy that was the overseer of this place. So he was not a king. But down further, in verse 9, the king was distressed. And so he throws that in, and I think that's sort of a not so subtle idea that this is Satan's kingdom. And this man is acting satanic in there.
Did John the Baptist write Revelation, or is it a different John?
That's a different John.
That's not I was thinking. He's in prison long enough, maybe.
Yeah, no, different John.
Didn't say how long he was in prison for.
Any other thoughts about this? So here is a carryover to the next story. Okay, if we go back to the Old Testament, to the books of Kings, we see two prophets. One is Elijah, and John the Baptist has been identified as Elijah. In the book of Kings, Elijah dies. Okay, do you remember how Elijah dies in the Old Testament? Yeah, I'm getting gestures. Apparently, he didn't die in the sense that we see people die, but he was taken to heaven. Okay, so, and what's interesting is that he does that, and soon after that, you recall who was the next in line to Elijah? Elisha. Okay, there's a next prophet, Elisha. And so Elijah dies, and then Elisha takes over. And if you look at 2 Kings, the first few chapters, Elisha does a lot of what Jesus does. Okay, he heals people, he raises people from the dead, he provides for them. And what we're going to see is there is a lot of similarity here towards the death of John the Baptist, the end of Elijah, and then Jesus taking over as Elisha, or the new prophet. Okay, that was pretty clumsy, but the idea is prophet is running behind these stories that are coming up. This is the picture. So Josephus tells us this is where John the Baptist was beheaded. So several weeks ago I showed you some pictures of Herod built all of these fancy fortresses out in the wilderness because he was paranoid. Here's another one. And so this is Machaerus, east of the Jordan River. Apparently, it's far enough away. There's a river between it, but they could see smoke signals from Jerusalem from this place. So apparently, Josephus claims this is where John the Baptist was when he was beheaded. Not much left, but still identifiable. Elisha, after Elijah dies, or goes to heaven, whatever you want to call it. Elisha comes, he does a lot of what Jesus does. One of the things that Elisha does is described in 2 Kings 4:42, this little section, and it's going to lead right up to where we're going to go with the next pericope in Matthew. So, a man came from Baal Shalishah, bringing the man of God 20 loaves of barley bread, baked from the first ripe grain, along with some heads of new grain. Give it to the people to eat, Elisha said. Okay, so this is Elisha they're talking about. Some folks brought him some bread. He said, give it to the people. And the servant said, how can I set this before 100 men? Okay, so they brought him a little bread. Elisha told him to go feed the people with it. And he said, how can I? They're just not enough. But Elisha answered, give it to the people to eat, for this is what the Lord says, they will eat and have some left over. Then he set it before them, and they ate and had some left over, according to the word of the Lord. Okay? We're going to talk about feeding 5,000. And Jesus following this prophetic succession after Elijah. And what we're going to see is that he does similar things, okay, tying him into this prophetic idea. So Jesus feeds the 5,000. So this is right on the ending of Elijah, John the Baptist. Here is the first thing Jesus does. So Jesus feeds the 5,000. When Jesus heard what had happened about John the Baptist, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. And when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. Jesus replied, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. But we have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. Bring them here to me, he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave it to them, to the disciples, and the disciples gave it to the people, and they all ate, and they were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 baskets full of broken pieces that were left over. And the number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Any thoughts?
So Elijah is a prophet, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he's reflecting back an old prophet.
Mm-hmm.
He's not Jesus reincarnated.
Right.
He's just a different prophet used to be an example of the future Christ coming.
I think that's right. Yeah.
That's
Okay.
kind of the definition of a prophet, too.
Mm-hmm.
I just had friends that said, oh, Elijah was Jesus.
Oh,
No,
yeah.
they're different people.
They are, but God does things in the same way. And so it's not the molecules of Elijah reforming again and having a new person, but it is God acting
Through us.
in the same way. Yeah. And that means things to people. I mean, they have a picture of what Elijah did way back, and now they see that same thing happening. They think God was acting then, God is acting now. So I think that's a nice point. Yeah. Sir.
Yeah, just with that dualism concept, we also have the church has always been here.
Mhm.
It's just been in different forms, but the camp of Israel, how, obviously a lot applied to us, but ultimately it's this, God is existing, and so he's doing things, he does it a little differently, of course, in various ways, various
Right.
Hebrews, but ultimately it's like, there was always some prophet leading people, there was always someone, and theoretically, they didn't, the Jews should have recognized Jesus because they already knew the prophet Elijah.
And what
Prepared for it.
That's a good point, yeah. Yeah, and even behind this whole thing, C.S. Lewis wrote a book called Miracles, and I know you guys have heard me talk about this before, but this is one of the front and center stories that tell what's going on here. Okay, miracles, in one sense, we look at them and they amaze people. But on the other hand, Jesus does in a very short time period what God does on a regular basis all the time. Okay? And so here, Jesus in a very short time feeds 5,000. Elisha fed 500. But Jesus feeds millions every day. Or God feeds people every day in ways that you just think about how in the world can you get that much food going. And so when you want, in book of John, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. That's what miracles are about, okay? We're getting in a fast, short time a picture of the Father, okay, what God does on a larger scale. And so here, we see Jesus showing what God really does. What is his nature? What's he about? Let me just ask you this. Feeding 5,000, if you go to the Old Testament, did God feed people? What was the big manna in the desert? Okay. So again, we're kind of seeing the idea. Feeding the 5,000 is a miracle, but we often kind of stop there and said, well, gosh, Jesus was powerful. He could feed. No, it was not that. I mean, that is part of it, I suppose, but it really is this idea of he is carrying on what God does. Okay, and so the manna feeding the Israelites, here is bread feeding people who are in the wilderness, another theme that's in this. So the wilderness, unable to fend for themselves, and so, is this still on? I just clicked this button inadvertently. So lots of strains of things. Prophets going on here. Pictures back to the wilderness wanderings with manna. Prophetic stuff from Elisha. All sorts of just layers giving a picture of who Jesus is. Any comments or thoughts? Or yeah, so.
I think I read somewhere that, like when this happened, then the people followed Jesus everywhere, expecting to be fed after that. Referring back to the manna in the desert.
Right.
Jesus and God.
Well, and that's not totally unreasonable, because we won't get to it, but a chapter or two later, he feeds 4,000. I don't know exactly where all that goes, but it is something that Jesus does not just once. In fact, this story is the one that shows up, or at least this in the variation of 4,000 shows up 6 times in the New Testament. Every gospel shows this up.
It was like 2,000, 2,500.
Yeah, some bigger, but so variations on this show up a lot. And so it was important to the gospel writers that we understand what God does. The picture of it.
My logical brain is always been trying to figure out how big is the fish.
Jumped out while we were saying that's what we are called to do as well. When I was hungry, we gave you something to eat. That's a sign of being Christ-like.
Right.
Being God-like.
And that's, of all these miracles that go on, that's kind of what we're called to. And so, Jesus heals, God heals. I'm not going to say I'm going to be able to faith heal you, but you can be part of it. And so, in all this teaching that Jesus does, healing, that's what we're about. Yes, ma'am.
I think it's interesting too that when they were in the desert and they were fed manna, they were given it a day at a time. They couldn't hold anything over because it was oil.
They were, and you kind of get the idea that was to kind of train them to depend on God. It's interesting here, though, the picture of the Messiah is overflowing feast. In Elisha's case, there was more bread left than he needed. Here, there's more than he needed. In feeding the 4,000, there's left over. And so it seems that there's an abundance shown here. And that's a little bit different than manna, where there was plenty there, but they couldn't store it up. They had to just rely on God that the next day there would be some more there. So.
And in the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our
daily bread.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that's part of, we talk about why do we pray? Well, we think about ourselves in relationship. God knows what we need, but we need to think about what is our place and what is God's place. How do we depend?
The practical part of me wants to know how long this took.
Yeah.
It was breakfast for some.
Dinner for others.
Dinner for others.
Well, my guess is miraculously you can do things.
A lot of ushers were appointed.
That's right. Maybe they learned to pass communion that fast. And that's another thing. It's interesting here. This language is much the same as in the Lord's Supper later on. I mean, how he breaks the bread and gives it to them and looks to heaven. So there's all sorts of layers that permeate these.
Also, 12 disciples, 12 baskets left over.
In basket.
I'm struggling to remember because the miraculous abundance is such a common miracle. I'm reminded, I'm trying to remember the details, which prophet it was, but the widow and the oil.
Right.
The oil, poured all the oil, and this miraculous abundance.
Yeah.
But again, it's for the lowly, it's for the hungry, it's not for the kings and the, it's those that are like desperate and turning towards him, like you were just saying, we need to be aware.
Well, and it's interesting that story of the widow's oil is in chapter 4 right there with feeding the 500 or 100 or whatever it was from Elisha. And so the widow became a widow. She was in debt. She needed, and so Elisha said, "Go get jars because I'm going to fill them up." And so he said, "Take your sons, go in there," and they just kept filling oil jars. And so the abundance was there, and the oil was still flowing, and they ran out of jars. And so they said, "We need jars," and he said, "Well, that's enough. Go sell it. Take care of yourself." So abundance is part of what's given to the lowly. I think many times. Going. Jesus walks on the water. Okay, another C.S. Lewis favorite. If you dig in, this seems like, wow, this guy's walking on water. In fact, Bill even this morning was talking about the Navy had a expression. If you were, I don't know if it exactly the setting, but if you were trying to do things you didn't have any ability to do, you're not Jesus, you can't walk on water. And so, there's cultural things here, but as you dig into this, there's as many layers in this one as there is in many of the other miracle stories that we see. One of the big ones here, I think, is to go ahead and look at and ask, what is this stormy sea? And what is this little boat? What are all these different moving parts going on here? And every commentator I know will pull this story and the modern day church dead parallel. Dead parallel? That's not what I intended to say, but analogous. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. Incidentally, this is the first time the disciples are on their own. Okay, they are by themselves. Okay, presumably Jesus is still with them, but this is their first outing without him, physically there. My assumption is he's in the background, and this may be something that we should kind of pay attention to. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. This is the first prayer that we see of Jesus, and we're already chapter 14. And I'm sure he did before, but this is the first time we see specifically him praying in the book of Matthew. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by waves because the wind was against it. Buffeted, I don't know if your other translations have it, but it's often translated tortured. The boat was tortured because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why do you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all of their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. Was that just the first bell? Okay. I think there are so many layers here. Let me just mention a couple, and if you have comments, throw them in there. One of the big things that commentators talk about is this idea of this little boat on a stormy ocean. And the analogy that they always bring up consistently is what the church looks like. What are we? And if we picture ourselves, quite often, we are disciples, and we don't have Jesus face to face looking him in the eyeball, and there is some sort of storm going on outside, okay? Cultural, political, whatever, religious, all sorts of ways you could describe it. But it's this picture of being on this stormy sea and feeling alone, okay? Being tortured by what's going on around. So there's kind of one layer there. There's another layer there of Jesus walking on water. Somebody tell me from the Old Testament, early on, when was there water? Okay, before Moses even? In creation? Chaos, okay? And that's the picture I'm trying to draw here of this chaos. In fact, you get pictures of this chaos over and over again in the Old Testament. Everywhere from Job with Leviathan and what's the Behemoth, the creatures in the ocean, and the Noah's flood, killing off everybody in the world. I mean, chaos has always been associated with this. And in the creation story, God moves over the face of the water and calms it. And here, again, we see Jesus in that same kind of role on a stormy sea. I mean, in a practical sense, how do you walk on that? I don't even know. But here he is over the face of the waters, and the chaos is being calmed. Jesus is around, even though he's not in that boat. That didn't comfort the disciples much, but from our picture now, what we're supposed to see is the bigger sense of that. Yeah, David?
Against it, because in Genesis it talks about the wind hovering over the face of the waters.
Right.
It's kind of a calming influence,
Mm-hmm.
and it's usually the spirit is the wind.
Is the wind,
And
yeah,
so the spirit is against them in this case.
in this case, at least in the physical sense, yeah.
Spirit.
Well, and you think about it, where do we see a not tumultuous sea? The book of Revelation, in the throne room where God is, we have the glassy sea, the crystal sea. And so all of the chaos has been subsided. And you have the glassy sea there, calmed. And so that's another layer to take in. Chad?
I think that's kind of a matter of perspective too. A lot of times with water, because I've been out and the captain will say, "Oh, it's like a bathtub today," and it's like I'm puking my guts out over the side. but like it's all relative. Like a calm sea still is gonna batter you around, and you're gonna you walk in weird and all kind of stuff. So there is no such thing as like peace on the ocean.
At least not for very long. Yeah.
Right.
And I guess that ties over to, how do we picture ourselves? I mean, we can take a small picture of us in a boat and all the stuff going around and Jesus not there, or we can stand back and say, it feels like that, but Jesus is actually out there calming the chaos. And whether we see it or not, and whether we understand who he is or not, is another question. Joe?
The point to me is really, or one of the points that I take away is, when did Peter sink? It's when he doubted?
Yeah.
And when he took his eyes off Christ?
Off of Jesus, yeah. Mhm.
So,
Yeah, that's right.
He saw the wind.
Don't do that.
Scared him.
That's right. Well, and so I guess there's kind of another side to that. So quite often, that's what we think is, in our spiritual walk, we're walking amongst the waves and we take our eyes off Jesus, and then all of a sudden doubt comes in and we start sinking. The other thing is, why did he get out of the boat in the first place? He wanted to know if it was Jesus or not. And so that's another question, okay? We're in the boat, we're with each other, but when we get away from each other and start out in this water, that takes us away from us, okay? It starts being me looking for God for my own whatever reason. And so maybe a couple of ways of looking at Peter's journey out into the water there. Okay, let's see what he would do. And yep. Yeah, and that's something we see in Scripture, the fleece being laid out to see if it's wet or not, because they want God to prove that he's actually who he says he is, and he's there. And that's a question. He is. In a lot of ways, he's us. And I don't think we should spend too much time psychologizing Peter. I think he's just all the disciples. He's us. And this walk out there is us. Is us.
I don't know what alternative interpretations are. It's a ghost. I mean, they really believe in ghosts.
Yeah. Well, I think they just didn't know who it was.
I think he set him up big time. I never noticed before. It says shortly before dawn.
Mm-hmm.
And I just snapped to that picture. I used to do a lot of winter camping, a lot of people here hunt. When you see something just before dawn or just after dusk, it looks very, very different than in the daylight.
Yep.
It likes to spook you a little bit.
Yep.
I think he totally set him up with that time.
Well, it does say the fourth watch, which is, 3 to 6 in the morning sometimes. So yeah, that's when I'm usually laying awake, stewing over everything in the world. So.
I don't know, I see it as, Jesus says come, so I'm thinking he was excited.
Oh.
Jesus says come, and so he's excited, just like when you born Christian, you're so excited, come. And then all of a sudden, you see everything around you, and then like, oh my God.
Did I bite off here?
Yeah.
No, that's a good idea. Yeah.
Because he literally said come.
Yeah. Well, Peter asked him, and he said,
He's so
come
excited.
on. That's right. The excited new Christian. Yeah. Well, guys, I think that's the end. Let me invite you. We have a birthday today. I know, and I'm not going to say much more about it, except Gwen has provided cake and things back in the foyer. And so go back and celebrate Barb's 92. And so happy birthday. So you guys go back and enjoy her birthday.